Welcome back to Central Colorado Ballistics. My name is Wally. The ATF regulates firearms, but it wasn't created because of firearms. It was created because of Prohibition. And that origin story changes everything. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives exists today because of Prohibition, a constitutional amendment that failed, a social experiment that collapsed, and a federal enforcement structure that never went away. So the real question isn't what does the ATF do? The real question is, why does an agency born out of Prohibition still control firearms in America today? Before the 20th century, the federal government had almost no role in firearm regulation. Gun laws were handled by the states, sometimes cities, and enforcement was local. There was no federal gun registry, no licensing system, no national firearms enforcement agency. Even after the Civil War, even after Reconstruction, even after westward expansion, the federal government stayed mostly out of firearm ownership. Did you know the first major federal firearms law didn't come until 1934? Over 150 years after the Second Amendment was ratified. That matters because it tells us the federal government didn't start by regulating guns. It backed into it. Everything changed in 1920. That's when the 18th Amendment goes into effect. Alcohol is banned nationwide. The federal government suddenly has a problem. How do you enforce a law that millions of Americans refuse to obey? The answer was revenue enforcement. Alcohol had been one of the largest sources of federal income before Prohibition. So enforcement fell under the Treasury Department, not law enforcement as we understand it today. Agents were originally tax collectors. Their job wasn't public safety. It was making sure the government got its money. Did you know the earliest ATF agents were known as revenuers? Not cops. Tax enforcers. Prohibition doesn't reduce crime. It creates organized crime, bootlegging, smuggling, and violent criminal syndicates armed with machine guns. The government responds not by repealing Prohibition, but by targeting the tools criminals use. That's where the National Firearms Act of 1934 comes in. not a gun ban, a tax scheme. Firearms weren't outlawed. They were made more expensive, regulated, and buried in paperwork. If you watched my last video on the NFA of 1934, you already know this law was never meant to affect average Americans. But enforcement structures don't stay limited for long. And once that enforcement exists, it looks for reasons to justify itself. For decades, what we now call the ATF existed as a bureau inside the Treasury Department. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. Not because these things are morally similar, but because they were taxable. Enforcement power grew quietly, incrementally, often without public debate. Did you know the ATF didn't become an independent federal agency until 1972? Nearly 40 years after the NFA was passed. And it didn't move out of the Treasury until 2003, when it was placed under the Department of Justice. That means for most of its existence, the ATF wasn't even structured like a modern law enforcement agency. Here's where things get controversial. Congress writes laws. Agencies enforce them. But over time, the ATF gained something powerful. Interpretive authority through rulemaking, through classification letters, through changing definitions. What is a machine gun? What is a receiver? What constitutes readily convertible? Did you know something can be legal one year and a felony the next without Congress passing a new law? That's not legislation. That's administrative power. The ATF was created to enforce alcohol taxes. It expanded during Prohibition. It survived Prohibition's repeal, and now enforces some of the most contentious laws in America. Laws tied directly to a constitutional right. That raises a serious question. Should an agency born out of a failed social experiment still define the boundaries of the Second Amendment? Especially when Congress avoids passing clear laws. Courts defer to agencies, and citizens are left guessing what is legal. This video isn't about hating the ATF, and it's not about defending criminals. It's about understanding how power accumulates, how temporary solutions become permanent institutions, and how enforcement agencies shape rights even when they weren't created to. The question isn't whether the ATF enforces the law. The question is, who should decide what the law means? Congress, courts, or an agency born out of Prohibition? That's a conversation worth having. And the story doesn't stop there. Next, we'll follow the federal trail, exploring the laws that built on the 1934 NFA. The laws that quietly expanded national authority over firearms. These aren't just abstract rules. They define what's legal, what's taxed, and how the government can control firearms today. And this story doesn't stop at the federal level. Colorado shows how these frameworks can be mirrored at the state level. How local laws have adopted to the same logic to limit Second Amendment rights in ways that should have never happened in the first place. Understanding this trail is critical because the impact of these decisions isn't just historical, it's how everyday Americans interact with their constitutional rights today. Freedom secured, rights defended.